We'll say a few words in a minute, but I wanted to thank our writer, Claudia Durastanti, and translator Liz Harris for being here today. Their presence here today is the evidence of a happy confluence of having in our midst Francesco Chianese, Dr. Chianese, holder of a Marie Sklodowska Curie Fellowship with a project called Transit, which looks at connections among Italy and so many Italian immigrant and diaspora communities and their connections through language in all of its iterations, as you will learn here today, language iterations and culture. And I will let Dr. Chianese say a few words about his project and how all of this came about.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Dr. Donato. Many thanks for being here with us today. I am really delighted to have writer and translator Claudia Durastanti and translator Elizabeth Harris here today for this event, which is the main event organized at the Donato Center as part of my research project, Transit, many diasporas from one transnational Italy, as you know, Dr. Donato has kindly said already. The convergence of three circumstances made me really emotional today. The first one is the possibility of having this event in person at the Anatole Center, as in the good old times, I would say, as you used to do when I was here as a Fulbright scholar 3 years ago. Again, generously welcomed by Dr. Donato when she was the chair of the George Grazia Dio Center. The second remarkable circumstance converging here today is the possibility of presenting the author of a book, which I consider crucial in the understanding and the circulation of the dialogue between Italy, the US, and the UK through their multiple migration in dialogue, with the translator who adapted this book into English. It is a book involving me personally as part of a triangular migration among those three countries, and engages my research at both scholarly and personal level. As you can see, I'm here in the US, not in Italy at the moment. It is a relevant book because it explores languages and translation in their true potential of inclusion, in their capacity to connect people that cannot access communication in the same ways, beautifully describing the discomforts of the diasporic experience from the viewpoint of a category of individuals who encounter additional difficulties in learning a new language. Claudia's book is a powerful message of inclusivity, which strengthens our engagement as educators working for a university institution that stands out, among many others, for its policies of inclusivity. I introduced La Straniera, today strangers I know, in the syllabus of the classes on the Italian diaspora and the Italian American culture, which I have developed here when it was just published in 2019 in Italy. Some of my students of the previous class are here today together with the ones who are currently working on this book. And I believe this is a great opportunity for them to meet the author of such a book and her translator. The third circumstance that make me emotional is the possibility of presenting the American edition of this book, which timely has been published while I'm here again as a Marie Sklodowska Curie Fellow at the Donato Center this time. Again, welcomed by the director of the center, Dr. Donato, whom I take advantage to, thank again. The book has traveled so much with the author from Europe to the Americas in countries interested historically by the Italian migration and countries which had nothing to do with that. Portugal and Spain, Netherlands and Germany, France and Sweden, Argentina and Brazil, and ultimately the United Kingdom and the United States. Durastanti has a rich and multifaceted background as a translator, a journalist, a blogger, and now she's editing a small publisher called La Tartaruga, which has a huge importance for history of feminism in Italy. Harris has translated Italian classics such as Mary Regan Stern and Antonio Tabucchi. I believe they really built a dialogue between this book, as you will see today, and I'll give back the stage to Dr. Donato for the remaining of the speech. Thank you all again for being here. Thank you to Claudia, Elizabeth, and Dr. Donato again.
So as I was saying, I'm very happy to be here and to represent the center that carries my name, thanks to the generosity of our donor, Mario Giannini. Over the past 5 years, we have assembled a dynamic team of faculty. I'd like to introduce them. Dr. Giulia Togato and Dr. Adria Martin Moore our professors of translation studies, please stand up. Welcome to you both and your students. We are also very fortunate to have here Professor and Center Associate Director Manuel Romero and Professor and Donato Center Coordinator Alessandra Balzani. Please stand up and be acknowledged. I can tell you nothing would happen without the two of them, all of the coordination for this event. I would also like to sincerely thank two of our Italian faculty members for being here and bringing their students. Professor Daniela Zapador Guerra, please stand up, and Professor Sienna Hopkins. And your students, thank you. You know, we do these events for the students, but the students come when the professors come. And I just want to really thank you for being here and helping. But I would like to pay a special debt of gratitude to the faculty and students of the American Sign Language and Deaf Cultures program at CSULB, who you see here today interpreting this presentation. Doctors Juanette Reynolds and Katie Kalin, we are so fortunate to have you and your students, and to have at CSULB translation and interpretation studies that allows us to really move across languages and cultures, deaf languages and cultures as well. The relevance of deaf cultures will become immediately obvious to you as you hear the presentations of our two speakers. Let me introduce to you for opening remarks, Associate Dean of the College of Liberal Arts, Dan O'Connor. Dan, I really want to take the opportunity to publicly thank you for all of your support. A lot of times the deans and the administrators are behind the scenes. They're the ones who make this happen, and Dan has been with us the whole way, and he deserves a round of applause. I'm going to let Dan make his opening remarks, and then I will introduce our two speakers, and we will then proceed with Dr. Chianese with their talks, and then Dr. Chianese, who will do Q&A. So Dan.
Thank you, Clorinda. I can be heard all right, Manny? Thank you all. I want to thank all of you for coming here, students, staff, faculty, guests, and especially want to shout out to all the students from RGRLL and all the students from the ASLD program. And so really delighted to have this melding of our departments and our programs for this beautiful exercise today. I also want to thank the Donato Center. As Clorinda mentioned, the Donato Center is founded and supported by a very generous grant from Mario Giannini. I want to thank Dr. Chianese for his work in preparing this, and of course, Alessandra and Manny for the work that they did towards doing that, towards bringing this together. But the greatest job of all and the greatest energy and vision in this endeavor is that of Clorinda Donato, and so I'm very thankful for Clorinda and her work as well. We would not be here without your work and your vision and your energy. You know, part of my job as an associate dean is that I get to do public speaking events. I do a lot of introductions for events like this and that kind of thing, and other longer speeches, shorter speeches. This will be a short version, so not to worry. This is the first one that I have done in 2 years in front of a public live audience. And frankly, I can't believe that after 2 years, Clorinda would allow me to have a mic. So let me tell you about my last 2 years. No, I'm just kidding. Those of you who've had the opportunity to hear me give introductions or to welcome folks to events or to facilitate events on campus have heard me say what I'm about to say previously. And that is that it is my understanding that the mission and irrevocable responsibility of the College of Liberal Arts is that it and we represent the intellectual heart of the university. It is we in the liberal arts who nourish the life of the mind. And events such as this one are exactly what I have in mind when I describe it that way. So this book, I want to take a few moments to share some reflections on this book, and I will be very brief. This is the book that has brought us together. But I want to be very specific that this is my book. This is my version of Strangers I Know, because that is one of the wonders of great literature. And that is that we all read it and receive it in our own very personal ways. Each of you, should you have the book and buy the book and read the book, then you will have your own version of this book. And I encourage you to do so, because as I described so eloquently to the author a few minutes ago, it's a trip. This is a book that opens itself to us in a way, it serves itself to us in a way that I can only describe as raw. This is a novel of exploration, our heroine in constant search, a novel of revelation, a novel of profound sadness and equally profound joy, and also a novel of salvation. And there is a passage in it that reflected my own internal dialogue with this book. As an 8-year-old, our heroine, Claudia, skips school and sequesters herself in the attic of her parents' home, reading books her mother has gathered, her mother who hated fiction. And whether it was a book or a movie, her mother plagued Claudia with a question that ran through my own mind as I read Strangers I Know. And that question being, well, never mind, I'm not going to tell you. You'll have to read it yourself. Well, I'll just say that for my version, for my book, for my version of Strangers I Know, this is a book that is dripping with truth. And this is how we feed the life of the mind. So thank you for coming here, and enjoy the meal you are about to engage in. Thank you.
Dan, thank you so much for your reflections on the book. I want to tell the audience that you will have the opportunity to purchase a copy of the book. Should you wish to do so, they will be available for purchase here at the end of this presentation. Let me introduce our two speakers today. Claudia Durastanti, author of the book, has written many books, and these books have won prizes. For La Straniera, Strangers I Know, it was shortlisted for the 2019 Strega Prize and the Viareggio Prize. The book has been translated into 21 languages and is currently being adapted into a TV show. So you will be able to watch the TV version, but you need to read the book because that's always different, right? She graduated in cultural anthropology from the Sapienza University of Rome. Her work has appeared in Granta, the Los Angeles Review of Books, and the Serving Library. She is a member of the board of the Turin International Book Fair and co-founded the Italian Festival of Literature in London, which, if we have time to hear about it, is a very interesting enterprise. She has translated many books from English into Italian, works by Joshua Cohen, Donna Haraway, as well as Ocean Vuong's On Earth, We're Briefly Gorgeous, and F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. This is a new translation of The Great Gatsby, and that would be another whole presentation of its own to talk about the discrepancies between the first translation and Claudia's translation. She writes a music column for Internazionale and serves as a curator for the feminist imprint La Tartaruga, founded by Laura Le Petit in 1975. And let me now introduce the translator of the work in Italian, La Straniera, in English, Strangers We Know. The translator is Elizabeth Harris. She is a literary translator specializing in contemporary Italian fiction. She holds graduate degrees in creative writing and literary translation from the Johns Hopkins University and the University of Arkansas. Before moving to translating full-time, she was a professor of creative writing and translation at the University of North Dakota. Dan, this is something we should put together. She was telling me how great it was to put creative writing and translation together in her classes. Her translations appear in the Kenyon Review, the Missouri Review, the Literary Review, New England Review, among many, many others. Her full-length translations include Mario Rigoni Stern's novel Giacomo's Seasons, Giulio Mozzi's collection This is the Garden, Antonio Tabucchi's novels Tristano Dies, and For Isabel, a Mandala. She has received prizes for these translations. Again, with her and Claudia, I could take up the whole time talking about all the prizes they've won, but we want to hear them. And of course, she is the translator of the book that you are going to hear about today. So without further ado, Claudia and Liz and Francesco. Oh no, first Claudia and Liz, then Francesco.
Hi, thanks for coming today and for the generous introduction, the invitation. It's been an interesting couple of days working on the backstage of this event, and I was eager to find out that students and teachers and professors from different disciplines would come today, as the book I wrote, La Straniera, Strangers I Know, touches on different aspects of what writing fiction means or what the art of translation is. And of course, it does touch the issue or the topic of deaf culture, which I entered in a very angular position as I didn't openly recognize myself. I didn't know there was a word for someone like me, like Coda, a child of deaf adult, as I am the daughter of a deaf woman and deaf man, but I never learned sign language. And so my experience with that was, I immediately called it the experience of an alien, and aliens are a subject that is relevant to what I'm going to discuss today, in the sense that I've been avoiding this book to write about my life and the story of my family for a very long time. I think I took this decision when I was 6-year-old and I first started understanding what fiction is. I moved from Brooklyn to a small town in southern Italy, and this was already something that was an oddity because it was a sort of reversed migration from the future, what I considered to be the future, that is New York in the 80s, to this small town in southern Italy, which felt immediately to me like a deep experience of an archaic dimension, and so an experience of the past. And as soon as I got there as an outsider, the first questions were, you're bilingual, do you feel more attached to the Italian or to the English? And nobody was openly acknowledging the fact that I was raised in a polyphonic linguistic context, because there was also the deafness of my mother involved. There was a dialect that my grandparents spoke when they moved from southern Italy to the United States. And writing this book, I realized, and I called it a sort of black market of language that was really the linguistic dimension I was raised in. So questions were, do you feel more Italian? Do you feel more American? What language do you dream in? Who are you? Who do you belong to? Which is this kind of funny expression in a chi appartieni, which is sounds odd to translate because it sounds very patriarchal in a way. But what was really immediate to me, that it was the narrative of my life depended so much on the position of my parents. So when I would say my parents are split up, artists, divorced, my mother is deaf, he's deaf, they met while he was trying to jump off a bridge and she saved him. And I realized that the audience, the people around me, were immediately attracted by their life, their story, and I would disappear. And I was interested in fiction as an act of transfiguration of facts, and the open ability of altering facts of life and turning them into something more ambiguous and open to interpretation. This is why my first books don't openly acknowledge nothing of what happened and ended up in this book. When did my life or my parents' deafness become interesting to me? Strangers I Know is a product of someone else's fiction, I would say. Two events occurred that were interesting about the tone and the formal setting of this book. One is a line that opens the book by Emily Dickinson and says, "After a great pain, a formal feeling comes." I was interested in the word formal, not only because it set a tone, a sort of distance, not necessarily a coldness, but it was really pushing me to meditate on the temperature on what we write, autobiographies, memoirs, and not necessarily it has to be the hottest take or the hottest flowing of your feelings. So formal was also intriguing to me because it related to what's the form of a life, what's the kind of metaphor, and what are the representations of certain marginalities that ended up in this book. And the other fact was that a film came out, Arrival, by Canadian director Daniel Villeneuve. It's based on a short story by Ted Chiang called Story of My Life. To make it short, the premise of the story is that the aliens are going to come on Earth. I was a girl from the 80s, so I've seen plenty of films where the aliens were necessarily evil. They had plans to attack Earth. And then my brother, who was trying to explain my parents' deafness to me when I was a little girl, he said, "Oh, they're not really deaf. They're aliens that are planning to take over the planet. They pretend to be deaf because deaf are assumed to be necessarily good people." That's what you would say, often it happens, with a good disabled person, good deaf person, good per person, good migrant, in a way. So he was openly, unconsciously making a comment, a critique of the expectations we have on certain parts of identity. But when I saw the film, and then a friend sent me an article that was a comment, I think it was in the New York Times, on the very basic linguistic theory by Sapir-Whorf that I studied in college. So it forced me to think. So the main character of the short story in the film is a linguist, and she's asked to decode in a way what the aliens really want to say. And that's a question I never asked myself. I knew my parents were deaf. I knew they had their own peculiarities, and I just lived through them and I never really meditated upon them. And so it was through fiction, in a way, that they became all of a sudden interesting. And so I thought that I was going to write a sentimental linguistic essay because I was doing all of my best to avoid the word memoir that felt very obscene to me in a way. And then I started thinking why I don't want to call it a memoir, why I want to call it a novel from life. Who has access to a novel? So my mother has always been, and this is on the gendering of genre, if you want to say, my mother has always been a writer of diaries and journals. I've read them all of my life. And she says that that's the real La Straniera, that's the real Strangers I Know. This is the copycat version. So, but in a way, my mother couldn't have access to publishing. And was that because she didn't have formal interests, she didn't have aesthetic tools, she didn't have style? And why? What was the difference between the writer daughter and the woman who was taking account of her life through writing? And that got me thinking. There's a passage in the book where I openly say that the autobiography is the bastard genre of literature, in a way, because it's conventionally presented it as the genre of survivors. There has to be a trauma, there has to be an event that seizes, breaks a life in two, and is often a genre that is related to female writing, whereas if it comes often from a very conscious and formally coded experience out of fiction, which was a very popular genre in Europe, at least for the past, especially coming from French, in the past 20 years, I would say it was usually the work of a man. So that's something I wanted to factor in this book. But if I was not writing a sentimental essay on the lexicon of my family, what was I writing? What would make it a novel? And somebody helped me in the sense that my mother always told me that she met my father while he was trying to jump off a bridge in Trastevere. She saved him, and this was a very implausible fact. What were the chances that two deaf kids would be on the same bridge at that specific time? And so I grew up with this myth in a way, and I never discussed it until I got a little bit bored out of it. But it's very hard to, in a way, interact or openly disconfess the myth of a mother. And when I started thinking about this book, my father, I asked him something I never occurred of me to asking him, what was, how did you meet mother? And he said, I saved her from an attempted robbery in Rome. And so I thought, oh, this is wonderful. Now I have a novel because I have two contradiction versions of the same event. And this is what opens the book, is a poetic statement. I wanted to be a poetic opening of the book. And as the dean said before, it is a book that tries to be truthful, but the truth is not the main issue within this book. And I believe every family is a kaleidoscope of fictions anyway. And so this is what led the process. And I didn't have clues on how to handle this material. And I had these, I was grateful to Emily Dickinson, to Arrival the film, to my parents' version of the foundational act of their relationship. And then there were some books that I was reading at the time that were interesting in the use of the I, or the first person. And they had an approach of an anonymous I or decentered I. And this is a trilogy by Rachel Cusk, this British author. It's called Outline. And it is the story of this anonymous woman who speaks about creative writing. She teaches creative writing. She's a writer. And she tells the story of herself through conversations she has with other people. And the other book was Flights by Olga Tokarczuk, Polish author that won the Nobel Prize a few years ago. And it's this anonymous traveler, again, across Europe that is putting together anecdotes of Middle European culture across a century and a half. And I thought that was very refreshing and liberating, because we moved from the expectation that memoir has a very hot and charged I. And I wanted to treat my family not like a community, almost I was visiting as an anthropologist. I studied cultural anthropology, and I assumed my family was an object, like a foreign country. And my mother helped me again with that, because when I don't use sign language, it's funny because I gesticulate a lot. I lived in London for many years, and people thought, oh, you do this because you're Italian. And I was like, yes, I'm Italian, but I'm also constantly striving to make myself visible with my mother and she's embarrassed by me because she says these things you're doing don't make any sense. But what happened was that I think that when we move out of the household that we were raised in, there's a process of separation that occurs to anyone. And to a certain extent, we kind of forget the family lexicon. This is a reference to Natalia Ginzburg's novel that if you haven't read, I recommend reading. It's a novel that she wrote in 1963 about how her family spoke. And through the family lexicon, it was a meditation on collective life in Italy, issues of social belonging in class, and growing up as a woman in this post-war context. So what do we forget of this family lexicon? What does resurface after migration or changes in our life? So to me, it was very scary to realize that when my mother would visit me in London as an adult woman, I felt I could no longer know how to speak with her, and I was exhausted. I would fall asleep very soon, and I couldn't wait for her to leave, which is very brutal in a way. But then one day I broke out crying in an airport, and I said, I don't know why it's so hard for me to speak with you. I grew up with you. You're my mother. And she said, oh, no wonder you spoke Chinese for a week and you didn't even know Chinese. And so I thought it was very beautiful for my mother to find, she turned herself into another country to explain the gaps that we were having, and the fact that she, I think, gave up on sign language, which I regret so much, and between us, but I think she was always constantly trying to find a private language, an intimate language that would make us sort of spies and hide us from the rest of the world, and nobody could really be in tune with what we were saying in a room. It would be just me and her. And this issue of hiding in a way, but not as a stigma, or it can be very playful, being a spy in your own language. My mother had it, and this is the title of the book in Italian, La Straniera, because other than being a novel by Albert Camus, I love so much Lo Straniero, and I wanted to play with this gender element. It's something that I've learned through my mother when I was a little girl. She moved to southern Italy, and this often happens, this confusion between deafness and migration. There's a book I translated by author Charles Yu called Interior Chinatown. And when he's making a comment of how people would make fun of how Chinese people speak in New York and Chinatown, they kind of start speaking slowly as they're speaking with a deaf person. They start making acts that don't make any sense. And I've seen this kind of ambiguity between migration and deafness from a very young age. So people would immediately feel that my mother was speaking with a different syntax, that she had a louder voice, that her words were not coming out right. And they wouldn't immediately understand that she was deaf, and they would say, oh, where does she come from, this stranger? And I was always waiting for the adult person, my mother, to tell to these people, no, you got it wrong. I'm not a stranger, I'm Italian, but I'm deaf. And she never did that. And she was almost kind of proud that they wouldn't really get who she was. And I was a very moralistic child, because I thought that happiness had to do with you accepting how you come to the world with your skills, with your disabilities, with your limitations. I didn't really understand the stigma around it. And I was really preoccupied that by hiding, in a way, my mother would give up chances of adaptation. And when I wrote this book, I realized that this dialectics, this playing with labels or claiming things for yourself or denying things, is something, it's a game that we all play. So oh, sorry, I'm overstepping. I could talk for hours. But anyway, all of this ended up, I didn't touch all the points that I wanted to. I'm sorry, I can go on for hours, but this is just a brief account on why I decided to write this book and what you'll find in it if you read it, and thanks to the translation of Liz Harris. Thank you.
Wow. Can you hear me all right? Yeah? Great. I just, I'm so grateful that you all have invited the translator to come as well. Usually we're just in a room. COVID didn't affect me at all, because I just kept sitting in a room, typing away. And it's so nice to come out and to be able, I could talk for hours too, but I am not going to do that either. I'm going to try to keep it down. But thank you so much, Clorinda and Francesco and Manny and Alessandra. And it's just wonderful being here. And thank you, Claudia, always. I'm so grateful that I got to translate this book. I just love this book. The title of this presentation, I won't be reading or anything, is Translating Strange, which seemed appropriate given not just the title and the estrangement and thematically what's going on in this novel, but also because of Claudia herself as a translator and author, and also as just a very flexible person. I first met her, and what she told me was, my Italian is strange, so I want you to make the English strange. That's important. She also said, and this I love, she said, if there's an image in the Italian that doesn't work, change it, which that kind of freedom from an author immediately got me thinking about what I needed to do with this kind of book and this kind of freedom, but also this responsibility to this highly energetic, you described it as raw, that the language is raw. And I'm so glad that you said that, because the goal for me, of course, was to get the meaning of this novel across and to look at every word and consider it, but it also was to get across the language of this book. And that's the translator's true joy, is when there is language and style that you're working with, and trying to get across the strangeness and the rawness of this Italian in English. What does that take for the translator? I'm a literary translator, so I won't begin to, I don't understand all forms of translation, but I do know that for literary translation, it takes both being trusting of the author and believing wholeheartedly in what you're reading, but also being trusting in yourself as a writer yourself, and your understanding and love of English, for in my case, English, both together. And yet there's that, I must have the English be strange, that I have to remember that. I don't want it to sound like it's translated though, because that's not the point, right? How do you make it strange? And I think that has to do with Claudia's sense of style. So I have examples, if you wouldn't mind putting them up. I don't know if you have the handout. Is it up? Okay. I noticed by the end that my numbering, it's a good thing I'm a translator because my numbering is off. I don't know numbers. But in trusting the author, I see these are examples of the figurative language that's in the Italian that's kind of weird, but I'm not, as a translator, going to change that. Nectarine wounds, that's what it is in the Italian, and that's what it's going to be in the English. And it's surrounded by language that's clearer and it resonates. I have a lot of examples, so I'm not going to go, into detail about all of them. The next example, number 2, that I have, this is a wonderful stylistic trick that Claudia uses in the Italian. Lei mi dici che è normale, che io mi sento stanca. Okay, literally, you can see it's called a trot, the literal. She tells me that is normal, that I feel tired. I trust the author in this, and I simply translate that. I tell her it's exhausting. She tells me that's normal, that I feel tired. It's a little bit strange, but not really. It's a stylistic trick. It's just interesting prose. This is a weird section break. Example 3. The section break happens in the middle of a sentence, right? I'm just going to read the English. Her life then could still overflow its banks, and maybe that's what she was thinking about as she walked across a bridge one day in Trastevere and met my father, isolated and bored and wanting to die. That's the section break. The copy editor said, of course this is wrong. What do you want to do with this? Like, leave it as it is, because that's the way it was in the Italian. And it has to do with the thematics of the novel, just really interesting. I mean, I just had so much fun translating this. It was so interesting. If you go to the example 4, this happens early on in the novel. It doesn't really seem that strange, actually, but it also was something that editors wanted to change. In the original, I'm just going to look at the trot here down below. Do you see that trot? Besides hearing, my mother lost also other things in boarding school, a girlfriend in water. Is it up there on the screen? Okay, but that's twisted. And when I first translated this, I followed it along with her hearing, my mother lost other things, at boarding school, a friend in the water. I was captivated by it stylistically. Later on in the novel, on page 208 of the novel, you discover that this is actually thematically relevant, this twisting of the syntax, this is something she holds on to. My syntax is often contorted, my one remaining tribute to my mother. And so I held on to, I didn't realize it when I first twisted the syntax in the English, but every time that there was that twist, I would think about, do I want to iron it out, or should I hold on to it because this is her tribute to her mother, So that's a way to make the English strange. The next example, number 5, I don't have the Italian of this, but just to let you know that you can see that there are italicized words here. This is the way it shows up in the Italian. In the Italian version, marshes is the English word, and it's italicized because it's a foreign word. I decided that a way to hold on to English as being foreignized is to maintain the italics. And there's no italics for Italian words, and there are a lot of them in the novel. Those are all just standard Roman, okay? And the English words that she's reflecting on and lingering on with her tongue, I make those italics. And so it's slightly foreign. Just, a little quirk to try to make the English strange. Um, these are ones that are, there are so many details that go into translation, and it's kind of, you start to go insane with the amount of decision making that you have. But then we start to get into what is translation itself? What is it? You know, and that I feel is a part of this presentation as well, that I started to translate strangely. On the example 6, in the original, Claudia, do you have that? Would you mind reading the Italian in Italiano Verbo? Do you want, you could come up here too.
In italiano il verbo sentire coincide con la capacità di provare un sentimento e un senso preciso, l'udito. In inglese non è così. To hear e to feel sono due azioni ben distinte. Non so come funzioni nelle altre lingue e non so come potrò tradurre le volte che mia madre resta distesa sul letto con gli occhi chiusi e bisbiglia "non sento niente" senza perdere tutto quello che vuole dirmi.
Okay, thank you. If you, can you focus it on the trot, and you all can just, you know, read that for yourselves. If I were to just translate what's here, I felt like the English speakers wouldn't fully understand what's going on with the verb sentire, that it is to feel and to hear is a very important element, not just of this paragraph, which is the end of a chapter, and the end of a chapter needs to resonate. And I really wanted people to understand this because this shows up in the very last lines of the book too. So I felt like it was really important. And so I wrote instead of translating. I became the writer here momentarily. If you go to the final translation, in Italian, the verb sentire includes the experience of feeling as well as a specific sense, hearing. But in English, to hear and to feel are two separate acts. I don't know how it works in other languages, and I'm not sure what I could do to translate those times my mother is lying in bed, eyes closed, murmuring, "Non sento niente." How little I feel nothing, I hear nothing, means to me, this cleaving in two. That's me, right? I felt like we needed this so that you all would understand what this meant. And of course, what I did with the translation was Claudia, I'm so blessed. She read the whole thing and answered a million questions and approved all of the things, you know, she made sure that I made sure she was happy with it. So, you know, having a living author is a blessing. It can be a curse too, but not in this case. It was a blessing. Do I have time for one more? How's the time going? Is it okay? Oh, okay, great. All right. Well, I might not get to the ending of the book, and so maybe you'll want to, you know, look at that yourself. I don't know if I'll have time, but you can see how that sentire works at the end. But I'll go with this one because I thought it was so interesting, this pushing on the notion of what translation is. And this goes against, I mean, I try to translate every phrase. I think about every word. I don't translate every word. Sometimes I drop words, but I try to, you know, to be very close to the original. This example, which is actually not number 6, it's number 7. I screwed it up. The editor was not happy with the ending, and wanted Claudia to rework it. And so this was the original translation. Then she started sobbing, and this is a girl in a wheelchair, and her boyfriend is with her, and she's, excuse me for swearing, but it's in the book. "You'd fuck me? You'd fuck me even in this chair?" He threw his bags down, knelt in front of her, and started kissing and licking her knees below her shorts, saying he'd fuck her, he loved her. I went by trying to be as discreet as possible, resisting the urge to turn around. They seemed very much in love, very attracted to each other, an avalanche of desire, which almost never happened to me. That's basically how the original ends. But, you know, of course it's translated. But then Claudia wrote, this is her email to me. Okay, she wrote after Laura's request for a change. She wrote the chapter there where the shadows lie. That's where this falls. I'd like to fix the ending. This is just what I mean to say. So Liz, please help me. They seem very much in love, very attracted to each other, an avalanche of desire. And then this is what she wanted it to say, right? And they were a spark in the dark, so rare, openly wanting, right? She wrote it in English. Please help me to say this in English. You know, I don't know what kind of translation this becomes, because this is what I came up with. I went by trying to be as discreet as possible, resisting the urge to turn around. They seemed very much in love, very attracted to each other, an avalanche of desire. A spark in the darkness, so glaring and so rare, if I turned back to see, they might flutter out of existence. This is Claudia giving me the leeway to pull what's out of her brain rather than what's on the page. It's, you know, the Borges quote of don't translate what I said, translate what I meant. You know, that's that in a nutshell, this kind of translation. It's the ending of a chapter. And, you know, if you want it to resonate, you have to really think about the sounds here. And so this to me felt like I was getting at what she meant. I did get it approved, you know, I got the final stamp. But I think I might be out of time. Am I right? We're 1 minute, right? Yeah, so I'm not gonna, just take a very quick look at the very ending of this. Again, manipulation, the very ending of a book, it really needs to resonate. At the very end, it is, you can see in the Italian, it's io torno, which is when every time I feel or hear the impact of the water, I come back, I return. I really wasn't happy with the sound of the ending. And I asked her, what do you mean by that? And she said, I think of it as like a superhero, like that I'm able to, you know, to come back again. And I decided that I could get away with it being that she rises up, you know, like I think of underdog flying through the air, that I rise, which to me had a better sound. So I'm just going to end the presentation with a translation of the ending of the novel. After years of describing herself as a victim, she also told me that everything that's happened in her life, she chose for herself. And in this declaration, I felt her freedom. I, of course, added the I felt there. I know I didn't disappear because someone found me before I could. I've listened to my mother and I haven't forgotten that I'm a person. I'm the daughter of a man who never jumped off a bridge. Every time I feel myself hit the water, I rise. When everything collapses, love remains. But is it a true story? All right, thank you so much.
Non ti volevo dire di stopparti abruptly, mi hai detto di wave. Can you hear me? Yes. Hi again. I am. Is it too loud? Isn't it? It's a little loud. I was really sorry to stop Claudia because, of course, I would listen to her talking for hours, which is actually something that I do, but you know, you might want to know that. Thank you, Claudia and Elizabeth, for your beautiful, beautiful talk, and for, you know, building up this dialogue through a book. It really was a dialogue, right, between two translators who build up a conversation through a book. I would open up the question. So, there is any question from the audience? Do we have another microphone, or I should run there, which I would be happy to do. By the way,
Yeah, my question is,
by the way, I have both
sorry.
the version of the book, the Italian one and the American one on the right, which are really different. So you can also see how books can dialogue through their covers. Question, please.
So when a writer talks to her or his translator, does he or she have the temptation to change something? Because that's the dilemma, I think, for some writers that didn't want to translate their own works, even though they knew the language. So is there that temptation to change something?
So I get questions about why I gave up on self-translation for this book, and I think it would have turned into a nightmare, kind of a Borges short story, the never-ending book, the never-ending process I would have edited, and so much would have changed. But that's not the main reason. I think that it would be a deep dissonance in the sense that my understanding of translation, I love a quote by John Berger, is not a binary relationship between language A and language B. There's always a hidden language that you're not openly aware of. And Liz, you touched that quoting Borges again before. And so I think if I'm not aware of this invisible underlying language, which of course it has a lot to do with the syntax of my mother, Liz was picking up clues as in a sort of detective game. So if you have a sort of, consider translation as a playful detective activity, you cannot be the author of the crime and the detective at the same time. It's very hard to switch codes and roles. And so I think it would have been given up possibilities and opening up interpretations that it was a deep sacrifice in a way. It was the opposite. Some authors who are familiar with English, and we talk about this all the time, have the temptation when they deal with their translator from Italian or Spanish to English to edit, to collaborate in a way and to say, oh, but what do you feel? How do you feel about this? This was not the case. This was a process of open trust to the extent that I was asking her to help me express myself, even with new sentences and things that were coming up. And it was very raw what I presented to her. And so she was almost like sculpting the meaning that wouldn't have been there without this output and relay and feedback system. So this was the case.
Do we have another question, please?
Hi, Joanna Tatro from Zoom writes, thank you so much for such an interesting and unique presentation. I am also glad to see the translator present. It appears as if there was a collaborative process happening between translator and author. I find it interesting that Claudia Durastanti, although a translator herself, didn't translate her own words. Was that a difficult choice to let go and allow someone else to translate such a personal work? Could you talk a bit about that process? But she also adds, it would be interesting to hear both author and translator answer this. So maybe the translator's perspective.
Yeah, I'll pass it to Liz because I think I already answered, but as a translator myself, I translate a Jewish and American author called Joshua Cohen, who's very challenging in terms of very maximalistic fiction. And one of the first things, I was very intimidated by working on his stuff because it was very different from what I usually do and what I usually translate. And he said, I want this to become your work, your book. I'm very aware of the fact that this is going to be an extended, expanded universe where your role is so important. So I think I had the benefit of someone passing this message to me, which I passed on to Liz.
Yeah, that is the something that you don't generally say in public, especially with the author present, is that at least this translator, I should not speak for all translators, I feel passionately that this is my book, you know? I mean, that's how, when we get together at our translation conference, all 500 geeky translators, we talk about our books. We do, because we love them passionately. Of course, it doesn't mean it's not the author's book, but what happens you have to passionately own a book. It's not like you swallow it to be able to translate it and create. I mean, you have to create a work of art, you know. So you better feel pretty possessive of it. Working with it could have been. I was very intimidated to work with someone who not only is a translator but is a native English speaker. You know, I mean, her English is fantastic. There's a difference, though, in spoken and written English, and I think that that in some ways handing it over to me, there's an incredible trust, but there's a freedom in letting someone else get their hands on it. And Claudia was a wonderful reader of the work, and there were plenty of mistakes I made. I was terrified of her finding the mistakes, but as I read the book, there's a part that she says in her own novel that she makes mistakes, and it's okay to make mistakes. And I took great comfort in that it would be okay to have. I'm terrified of making mistakes. Yet at the same time, I'm working on the book as a whole, and if I make an error, okay, that's too bad. But I'm working to create this universe. So I don't know that there's more to say about that.
Thank you. We have another question.
This question's actually for Elizabeth. I was just wondering, since in your presentation you mentioned how having a living author makes things both easier and also more complicated in some aspects. Obviously, not going to go too much into that, but I was just wondering how long the process took to translate the entirety of the book, whether it took more time or less time because of the involvement of the author herself.
This book, it took a while. I slowed down, but it wasn't because of working. I didn't work constantly with Claudia. I translated the whole book and got it, not just a draft. I was not willing to let her see it until I was very happy with it. And if there were, I wanted her. Is it weird to say? I wanted her to love me, I mean, I wanted her to, it's true. It's, I wanted her to read and be very happy and to love what she read. But then, there are places that I wanted to ask her questions and I wasn't quite certain about. And the whole process got slowed down because of COVID, because it was very hard to, this happened right in I started on it in January of 2020. And I got so slowed down psychologically by that. The process after I got it to her, she read it so quickly and it was amazing actually how thoroughly she looked at it more than once and found there were literary references that I missed that made the book so much more interesting when she corrected them. Titles that I don't read Stephen King, so I missed it. I missed that there was the first line of it in one of her chapter titles, and so it was actually pretty magical having her input, and she was very supportive. So.
As a scholar that works on Claudia's works, I totally relate to Elizabeth's point about, being You know, I would like to be loved from Claudia when I write. But it's really hard to work with the living authors, I guess. You just have a lot of anxiety when you try to say, oh, what she's gonna think about this. Probably, you know, it's really, really tough sometimes. So other questions, sorry.
I have two questions. One for Elizabeth, and it's really just as a translator, how do you get over yourself in terms of the compromises you're constantly making and how they cause you so much time to think about, you know, like even the process of the verb sentire and how to do that. And that takes so much time, and could be sometimes every line could take you forever. So that's my question for you. And then my question for Claudia is I'm really fascinated by the title, because you were talking about not writing a memoir, and the English title very much indicates that it's a memoir because of the pronoun I. So I was curious about that, if you felt, and the translator's view on that, and if that was something that you belabored for a really long amount of time. And thank you.
The reason that I translate is the laboring over those things. I am really sad. When I hand the book over for the final, when it gets published, when it's at I feel depressed because I don't get to fuss with it. And that, to me, it's a living thing as I'm working on it. And I miss it now. I miss the book now. That's what I love about translating, is those puzzles and wrestling and yes, and I take way too long to translate. I'm a very slow translator. I couldn't make a living at it. So
Yeah, something Liz didn't say about when I read this draft in English was very sensitive for me, because it was my blueprint language, the language I should have been raised in, and then I was in exile. I had a very dramatic interpretation of my childhood. I would describe myself as an exile when I was a 6-year-old. And so when I read the English, something happened that didn't happen with the French, Spanish, even Dutch, which is a language I don't speak. I recognized myself in those languages, and when I read Liz's translation, I said, it feels like reading the book of someone else, which was the highest compliment for me. So it mirrors what my mother said about this book. My mother can't stand fiction. In order to be drawn into something, it has to be a true story, autobiographical account. And so this is based on her life, something she told me since I was a little girl, and pretty accurate on her shared memories. She reads the book and it goes, oh, it's a beautiful novel, you know, it's not me in there. And so I thought she acknowledged that the process was complete, and I acknowledged the same with Liz, which was really what I wanted, to sound, appear or feel like a stranger to my own self. And this is related to your question. We had a very hard time coming up with the title. We were interested by the possibility of keeping the gender, and so strange brackets her, like a wordplay between stranger and strange her. The publisher said it was a commercially challenging because of, you know, how do you look it on Amazon? That's the first answer. And also it sounds too French, like too nerdy in a way, or too pretty or too cute. And so out of a list, Strangers I Know came out, and I thought the switch was interesting because it was moving from the main character, my mother, and the inheritance of strangeness when I became a migrant myself. All the people that activate migration in this book are women. So I was a little sad to lose that, but in a way, it placed the focus more on, is the I the most intimate thing, or is the first person narration necessarily more intimate than third person narration? And I think in the back of my mind, I was thinking by a random quote I read by Michel Foucault years ago, when he said, details or accounts or what happens in my sexual life is not the most intimate thing you can say about me, but we come from an upbringing where we think that the deepest intimacy is connected to that. So when it comes to fiction, we think that autobiography and memoirs are necessarily more sensitive or compared to the I. This book to me feels, in a way, and it's the story of my life and my family, least personal than my fiction and my previous work. I had a very visceral third person's
in my previous fiction. And there is one episode in this book when I tell that I was kidnapped by my father when I was a little girl. I already said that in my second novel, but it wasn't Claudia and my father. It was Chloe and Tony, and it's set in the East Coast, different time scale. It was the same episode. When I wrote about that, the tone, if you read that in fiction, is that of an angry daughter trying to process the fact in a very cathartic way. And I presented that book as fiction. It was my real memoir. This book that has all the apparatus and the context and the expectation of being a memoir, I wanted to really make a case of who deserves a novel. And I wanted to handle my father almost as if he was removed from me in a way, and he was a fictional character. So to me, this was very interesting in a way to use this sort of decentered eye.
Do we have time for how many questions more? Just last one? Okay. Alessandra has one.
Clint Taylor from Zoom has one. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. My question is for both Claudia and Elizabeth about their path to becoming translators. What got them started in the field, and what do they enjoy or find frustrating as translators?
I belong to the infamous category of writers that are translators. And also another troubling aspect is that I was bilingual. So they usually say that is not the ideal case. You have to be very strong in your mother tongue, and you have to be very aware of the destination language. But if you're stuck in between, while I experienced it, to me, the closest metaphor to translation is, space traveling. You land back on Earth, but you still have memories of where you've been. So there's in-betweenness that is natural ontological condition of translating. And I thought that my being bilingual could actually help and not be a flaw. But I started terribly. It wasn't my idea to translate, but in Italy, a publisher said, oh, she knows English, she's a writer, she likes music, let's have her translate a Tom Waits book of interviews. And my translation was sloppy and lazy because I thought that I knew English very well because, I spoke it at home and I had memories for childhood, and I didn't put the effort to research, which is fundamental. A lot of translation is learning about different disciplines. Is not only a matter of the fact that you know how to speak it, you have to study it, language, and you have to study the subject matter. So if it's music or if it's cooking, you have to really become aware of the lexicons. So it was a very, and I thought I was never going to translate again because nobody trusted me, but I think you learn from the mistakes, and often you meet editors, hopefully, that are aware of the fact that you need to get rid of the first 2-3 books in order to, it gets better. That's a stereotype, but it gets better over time.
My translation path was, I was a major in art history, and I took Italian, and I thought I might go on to grad school in art history, but I didn't. I actually was just working in a restaurant for years, but I just kept taking Italian classes because I loved it. And I decided to go on and study creative writing. I got into a program at Johns Hopkins, and I had to take a language exam to complete the MA there. And I started to translate Italo Calvino's Marco Valdo over the summer. And as I was doing it, I compared it to William Weaver's translation, and I realized, oh, I'm really bad at this. And I really loved it. And I thought at that time, boy, I wish I could do this. And it turns out I could. I wound up going on from Johns Hopkins to the University of Arkansas. And there was my next door neighbor in his office was the director of the literary translation. And we became friends, and he persuaded me to take his workshop. And I fell in love, and it, just went from there. And while I taught creative writing, really pretty early on, I cast off the shackles of fiction and went whole hog into literary translation. And so I was a professor of creative writing, and my creative work was all literary translation. That's how I got tenure. That's how I got to be full professor.
So I think we should wrap it up. I would just share with you this story of the the first time that I met Claudia was at the presentation of Joshua Cohen's book. So I knew her as a writer, but I didn't know her as a translator. And she was also interpreting for him. So she was there in, so many different personalities and identities. And that's the moment that I really, really, really understand what complicated process is, translating a book, especially, if you are a writer yourself. So I really hope that this event gives you, a better perception of what kind of complexities usually are hidden behind translation, because all of us sometimes just see books and we don't know anything behind them, right? So thank you for coming here today. Thank you to Claudia and Elizabeth to accept our invitation. Thank you to Dr. Donato for being Dr. Donato. And
I just want to invite everybody to the reception, and if you would like to purchase a book, where are they, Danny, back there? Oh, over there.
yeah,
You just go over there and with your Visa card, I think. Purchase a book from them.
from somewhere.
Okay, and Claudia will sign it, and Liz will sign it.
Exciting. Thanks also to Manny and Alessandra for all the work that they put in this. Thank you. And again, to our wonderful interpreters.